d4. Queen's pawn opening, opening line. The queen's pawn opening move is somewhat slower than the popular e4 because white will not be able to castle for 3 more moves. Its advantage is that it gives white more control over tactical surprises and often provides more lasting initiative and pressure. e6. Horwitz defense, opening line. Transpositional. e6 is often played by those who prefer the French defense, e4, e6, d4, and who don't mind most lines of the Dutch, d4, f5, but wish to avoid the Stoughton gambit, d4, f5, e4. Knight f3. Horwitz defense, opening line. With likely transposition into Indian defenses, the Queen's Gambit, or Dutch lines. f5. Dutch defense, transposed, opening line. g3. Dutch defense, opening line. Knight f6. Dutch defense, transposed, opening line. Bishop g2. Dutch defense, transposed, opening line. d5. Out of opening book. Bishop e7 would have been in the Dutch defense book opening. Castle kingside. Bishop d6 clears the way for a kingside castle. c4. Castle kingside. b3 removes the threat on white's pawn at c4. b6. c takes d5. e takes d5. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Bishop a3 partially pins black's bishop at d6. Bishop b7. Bishop takes d6. Attacks black's rook at f8. Queen takes d6. Protects black's rook at f8. Black wins a bishop for a bishop. Material is even. Knight c3. a6. Queen c1. Knight e4. e3. Knight d7. Queen b2. Rook a e8. Rook a c1. Rook e7. b4. b5. a4. c6. a5. h6. Rook c2. g5. Knight e2. Queen f6. Knight c1. Knight d6. Knight d3 takes the knight away from the edge of the board. Knight c4 attacks white's queen. Queen c3 moves it to safety. Queen g7. Rook e1. Bishop c8. Knight f e5 attacks black's pawn at c6. Knight d takes e5 protects black's pawn at c6. Knight takes e5 attacks black's pawn at c6. White wins a knight for a knight. Material is even. Bishop d7 protects black's pawn at c6. f4. Bishop e8. Rook f2. g4. h4. G takes h3 en passant. Fork. King h8. King h2 removes the threat on white's pawn at g3. Queen f6. Rook g2. Rook g7. Rook e g1. Knight d6. Queen e1. h5. Rook c2. Knight e4. Block. Bishop f1. Rook f g8. Rook c g2. Rook h7. Bishop d3. Queen e7. Bishop takes e4. Attack. F takes e4. Black wins a bishop for a knight. Material is even. Rook h1. Bishop d7. King g1. Bishop g4 blocks white's pawn at g3. Rook h4 blocks black's pawn at h5. Bishop f3 threatens white's rook at g2. Rook g h2 moves it to safety. Queen e8 removes the threat on black's pawn at c6. King f2. Rook g g7. Knight takes f3. E takes f3. Creates a passed pawn on f3. Black wins a knight for a bishop. Material is even. Queen h1. Queen g6. Queen takes f3. Moves it out of the corner. Queen d6. Slightly better is Queen c2. Check. Analyzing. The chess master recommends queen to c2. You move your queen to c2, which checks white's king. White responds by moving the queen to e2, which removes the threat on white's king and attacks your queen. Your queen captures queen, which checks white's king. White answers with king captures queen. Your rook takes pawn, which creates a passed pawn on h5. White answers with rook captures pawn, which partially pins your rook at h7. Your rook takes rook, which attacks white's rook at h2. White responds with rook captures rook, which checks your king. You move your king to g7, which moves it out of check. White responds by moving the king to f2, which attacks your rook. You move your rook to g6, which moves it to safety. White responds by moving the king to f3. You move your rook to d6. White counters with the pawn to e4. Your pawn takes pawn, which forks white's pawn at d4, and white's king creates a passed pawn on e4, and isolates white's pawn at d4 and white's pawn at f4. White counters with king captures pawn, which protects white's pawn at d4. You move your rook to d8. White replies by moving the rook to e5. You move your king to f7. White counters by moving the rook to f5, which checks your king. You move your king to e6, which moves it out of check. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a queen, a rook, and 2 pawns for a queen, a rook, and 2 pawns. Additionally, white's pawn structure is weakened. Queen d6. Slightly better is queen c2, check. Rook takes h5. Creates a passed pawn on g3. Queen takes b4. Attacks white's pawn at a5. Creates a passed pawn on b5 and isolates white's pawn at a5. Rook takes h7, check. Protects white's pawn at a5 and checks black's king. Rook takes h7. Removes the threat on black's king and forks white's rook at h2 and white's pawn at a5. Rook takes h7, check. Removes the threat on white's pawn at a5 and checks black's king. King takes h7. Attacks white's pawn at a5. White wins 2 rooks and 2 pawns for 2 rooks and a pawn. White is up a pawn. Queen h5, check. Protects white's pawn at a5 and checks black's king. King g7. Moves it out of check and attacks white's pawn at a5. Queen e5, check. Removes the threat on white's pawn at a5 and checks black's king. King g8. Slightly better is king f7. Diagnosing. The chess master recommends king to f7. You move your king to f7, which moves it out of check and attacks white's pawn at a5. White responds by moving the pawn to f5, which advances the passed pawn. You move your queen to b2, which checks white's king. White responds by moving the king to f3, which moves it out of check. You move your queen to b1. White counters with queen to e6, which forks your pawn at c6 and your king. You move your king to f8, which moves it out of check. White replies by moving pawn to f6, which pushes the passed pawn. You move your queen to e4, which removes the threat on your pawn at c6, forks white's queen and white's king, and blocks white's pawn at e3. White responds with queen takes queen, which protects white's king. Your pawn takes queen, which checks white's king. White counters with king captures pawn, which creates a passed pawn on e3. You move your king to f7, which threatens white's pawn at f6 and blocks white's pawn at f6. White responds with the king to d3. Your king captures pawn, which isolates white's pawn at g3. White counters by moving the pawn to e4, which pushes the passed pawn. You move your king to e6. White counters by moving the king to c3. As a result of this line of play, you win a queen and a pawn for a queen and a pawn. Additionally, white's attack potential is somewhat decreased. Also, white's pawn formation is somewhat disrupted. Lastly, the pressure on your king is eliminated. King G8. Slightly better is King F7. Queen B8 check. Slightly better is F5. Diagnosing. The chess master recommends pawn to F5. You move your pawn to F5, which advances the passed pawn. Black responds by moving the queen to F8. You move your pawn to G4, which advances the passed pawn. Black counters with the queen to F7. You move your pawn to G5, which pushes the passed pawn. Black counters by moving the queen to G7, which threatens your pawn at G5. You move your pawn to F6, which protects your pawn at G5, attacks black's queen, and advances the passed pawn. Black replies by moving the queen to F7, which moves it to safety and blocks your pawn at F6. You move your queen to B8, which checks black's king. Black counters with king to H7, which moves it out of check. You move your queen to B6, which forks black's pawn at C6 and black's pawn at A6. Black responds with the king to G6, which attacks your pawn at G5 and blocks your pawn at G5. Your queen takes pawn at A6, which creates a passed pawn on A5. As a result of this line of play, you win a pawn. Additionally, black's attack potential is somewhat decreased. Also, your pawn development is greatly improved, and black's pawn structure is slightly weaker. Lastly, the pressure on your king is eliminated. Queen B8 check. Slightly better is F5. King F7 moves it out of check and attacks white's pawn at A5. Queen C7 check removes the threat on white's pawn at A5 and forks black's king and black's pawn at C6. King F8 moves it out of check. King F3. Slightly better is F5. Analyzing. The chess master recommends pawn to F5. You move your pawn to F5, which advances the passed pawn. Black responds by moving the queen to B2, which protects black's pawn at C6 and checks your king. You move your king to F3, which moves it out of check and threatens black's pawn at C6. Black counters by moving the queen to B1, which attacks your pawn at F5. You move your queen to D6, which removes the threat on your pawn at F5 and checks black's king. Black replies by moving king to F7, which moves it out of check and threatens your pawn at F5. you move your queen to e6, which removes the threat on your pawn at f5 and checks black's king. Black counters with the king to f8, which moves it out of check. You move your pawn to f6, which advances the passed pawn. Black counters with queen to e4, which protects black's pawn at c6, forks your queen and your king, and blocks your pawn at e3. Your queen captures queen, which protects your king. Black responds with pawn captures queen, which checks your king. Your king captures pawn, which creates a passed pawn on e3. Black responds by moving the king to f7, which attacks your pawn at f6 and blocks your pawn at f6. You move your king to d3. Black answers with king takes pawn, which isolates your pawn at g3. You move your pawn to e4, which advances the passed pawn. Black counters with king to e6. You move your king to c3. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a queen and a pawn for a queen and a pawn. Additionally, black's attack potential is somewhat decreased. Also, the development of black's pawns is somewhat weakened. Finally, the pressure on your king is eliminated. King f3. Slightly better is f5. Queen b1. Slightly better is queen e1. Diagnosing. The chess master recommends queen to e1. You move your queen to e1. White replies by moving the queen to d6, which checks your king. You move your king to f7, which moves it out of check and threatens white's pawn at a5. White counters by moving the queen to d7, which protects white's pawn at a5 and checks your king. You move your king to f8, which moves it out of check and attacks white's pawn at a5. White responds with queen to f5, which removes the threat on white's pawn at a5 and checks your king. You move your king to g7, which moves it out of check and attacks white's pawn at a5. White responds by moving the queen to e5, which protects white's pawn at a5 and checks your king. You move your king to f7, which moves it out of check and attacks white's pawn at a5. White counters with pawn to f5, which advances the passed pawn. You move your pawn to b4, which advances the passed pawn. White replies by moving queen to e6, which forks your pawn at c6 and your king. You move your king to f8, which moves it out of check. White answers with pawn to f6, which pushes the passed pawn. You move your queen to h1, which removes the threat on your pawn at c6, checks white's king, and seizes the open file. White responds by moving the king to f2, which moves it out of check and attacks your pawn at c6. You move your queen to h2, which protects your pawn at c6 and checks white's king. White responds with the king to f1, which moves it out of check and attacks your pawn at c6. You move your queen to h1, which protects your pawn at c6 and checks white's king. White responds by moving the king to e2, which moves it out of check and attacks your pawn at c6. As a result of this sequence of moves, your attack potential is slightly increased. Additionally, your pawn structure is a little stronger. Also, the pressure on white's king is increased. Queen b1. Slightly better is Queen e1. Queen d6. Check. Checks black's king. King f7. Moves it out of check. Queen d7. Check. Leads to King f8, King g2, Queen e4, check, King h3, Queen e8, Queen f5, check, King g7, Queen d3, Queen e4, Queen b3, King f6, King g4, Queen f5, check, King f3, Queen e4, check, King f2, which does not result in any captures. Better is King g4, leading to Queen g6, check, Queen takes g6, check, King takes g6, King f3, King f7, King e2, King g7, King d3, King f6, g4, b4, g5, check, King f5, King c2, King g6, King b3, which wins a queen for a queen. King f8. Moves it out of check. Queen c8, check. Forks black's king and black's pawn at a6. King f7. Moves it out of check. Queen c7, check. Checks black's king. King f8. Moves it out of check. Queen d6, check. Checks black's king. King f7. Moves it out of check. King g4. Queen g6, check. Removes the threat on black's pawn at c6 and forks white's king and white's queen. Queen takes g6, check. Protects white's king and forks black's pawn at c6 and black's king. King takes g6. Protects black's pawn at c6. Black wins a queen for a queen. White is up. King f3. King h5. e4. Leads to b4, e takes d5, b3, g4, check, king h6, g5, check, king g6, d takes c6, b2, c7, b1, queen, c8, queen, queen, d3, check, king f2, queen, d2, check, king f1, queen, d1, check, king g2, queen, e2, check, king g3, queen, e3, check, king, h2, queen, e2, check, king, h3, queen, f3, check, king, h2, queen, e2, check. Better is g4, check, leading to king h4, f5, king g5, e4, d takes e4, check, king e3, king f6, king f4, king f7, g5, king g7, king takes e4, king f7, king d3, king f8, king e3, king f7, king e4. This was white's most significant error, but the game remained within reach of either player. Black eventually resigned. D takes e4, check. Yikes! Isolates own pawn at e4. Leads to king takes e4, king g6, f5, check, king g7, g4, king f6, d5, c takes d5, check, king takes d5, king f7, g5, king e7, king e5, king f8, g6, b4, king d4, b3, king c3, b2, king takes b2, king g7. Much better is b4, leading to e takes d5, b3, g4, check, king, h6, g5, check, king, g6, d takes c6, b2, c7, b1, queen, c8, queen, queen, d3, check, king, f2, queen, d2, check, king, f1, queen, d1, check, king, g2, queen, e2, check, king, g3, queen, e3, check, king, h2, queen, e2, check, king, h3, queen, f3, check, king, h2, queen, e2, check. This was Black's only critical error of the game. Although Black was able to recover the lost ground, Black still ended up resigning. King takes e4. White wins a pawn for a pawn. White is up a pawn in material. King g4 threatens White's pawn at g3 and blocks White's pawn at g3. f5 advances the passed pawn. King g5. g4 advances the passed pawn. King f6 blocks White's pawn at f5. King f4. King f7. g5 advances the passed pawn. King g7. Slightly better is King e7. Cogitating. The chess master recommends king to e7. You move your king to e7. White replies by moving the pawn to f6, which checks your king and advances the passed pawn. You move your king to e6, which moves it out of check. White counters by moving the king to e4. You move your pawn to b4, which advances the passed pawn. White responds by moving the king to d3. You move your pawn to b3, which pushes the passed pawn. White replies by moving the king to c3, which threatens your pawn at b3. You move your king to f7, which blocks White's pawn at f6. White responds with king takes pawn, which isolates your pawn at a6 and your pawn at c6. You move your king to e6. White counters by moving the king to c4. You move your king to f7, which blocks White's pawn at f6. White replies by moving king to b4. You move your king to e6. White counters by moving the king to c5, which threatens your pawn at c6 and blocks your pawn at c6. You move your king to f7, which blocks White's pawn at f6. White counters with king takes pawn, which creates a passed pawn on d4. Improving your material or positional strengths with this position is difficult. King g7. Slightly better is King e7. King e5. Slightly better is f6 check. Analyzing. The chess master recommends pawn to f6. You move your pawn to f6, which checks Black's king and advances the passed pawn. Black counters with king to f8, which moves it out of check. You move your king to e4. Black replies by moving pawn to b4, which advances the passed pawn. You move your pawn to g6, which pushes the passed pawn. Black responds with the pawn to b3, which advances the passed pawn. You move your king to d3. Black counters with the pawn to b2, which adds a promote threat at b2. You move your king to c2, which threatens black's pawn at b2. Black responds by moving pawn to b1 with a queen promotion, which checks your king. Your king captures queen. Black responds by moving king to g8. You move your king to b2. Black responds by moving king to f8. You move your king to c3. Black responds by moving the king to g8. You move your king to c4. Black answers with king to f8. You move your king to c5, which attacks black's pawn at c6 and blocks black's pawn at c6. Black replies by moving the king to e8. Your king takes pawn, which creates a passed pawn on d4. Black responds by moving the king to f8. You move your king to d5. As a result of this line of play, you win a pawn. Additionally, your pawn structure is stronger, and black's pawn structure is weakened. King e5. Slightly better is f6 check. b4 advances the passed pawn. King e4. Black resigns.